What does it actually take to keep people safe? Welcome to the Thought Leader Product Safety Innovation Podcast. I'm Trevor J. Morones, your host. Every day, products reach consumers with gaps that compliance alone can't catch. And the people working to close those gaps are the ones you'll hear from here. Each episode, we connect with leaders shaping product safety and public health, representing one of the four pillars driving real change: alliance, advocacy, awareness, and activism. Well, welcome back. I remember at the end, or part of episode 2, part 1, Dr. Darin Detwiler said, what happens when we have to segment this out? We always have to let people know that they have to tune back in for more. I'm Trevor Morones. I'm the host today with...
Hi, I'm Don Morrow.
Hi, I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler.
So I'm very thankful for Dr. Darin Detwiler to be here, as well as Don Morrow. And just a little bit of a recap for us from those that have not listened to episode 2 or 3. That's all right. You can always catch up. But it's important to emphasize that the intent of this podcast is really to provide a platform for our guests to share stories and to help people across regulated sectors that know each other and that each other actually carries a profound responsibility for product safety. Some wear parental capes, others wear leadership capes. And in these particular roles, the objective is to protect consumers as well as the brands in those leadership opportunities. But the common foundation, regardless of the cape, is that we all share the obligation to ensure product safety through awareness, advocacy, activism, and alliance. So for our listeners, a quick brief. This is part 3. And in part 1, we set the foundation with the critical value of storytelling. It's something that we each of us here really enjoys. And through part 1, we went down Darin's path from Navy's nuclear program to the loss of Riley Detwiler in '93 to the Jack in the Box outbreak, then to change the relationship to people and their food. Whereas part 2, I took us down my path, Trevor's path, the power of the consumer and how we can really vote with our dollars in another sense, and then real-time, real data, as well as recall behavior, and then building the next generation of product safety leaders. So here for part 3, we have questions for Don Morrow Jr. From popular demand. Listeners actually immediately provided us feedback, and they were like, we don't know everybody. Let's learn about each of us. So here we are for part 3.
Well, thank you, Trevor. I really like being a food safety professional, and I've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for about 40 years. And there's been a lot of people that I've worked for. There's been a lot of people that have worked for me. There's been a lot of people that I've mentored. There's been lots of mentors for me. And the one thing is that you're willing to understand that food safety is one of those things that you can't say no to. You have to say, yes, we're going to defend food safety.
Well said. I want to interject and say, what inspired you for this particular career path?
Okay, so I was the baby under the typewriter in a plant. My family had a processed meat plant in Amarillo, Texas, and it was called Blue Morrow Meats. And if you talk to people from Amarillo that have lived there for a long time, they'll really remember Blue Morrow sausage or Little Boy Blue corn dogs. They'll remember these things because they had them for breakfast. And it was one of those things. It was started by my grandfather in the late 1950s. He bought several companies and then kind of brought them together. And then he formed his own company, Blue Morrow Meats. And my dad was in veterinary school at the time at Oklahoma State. I tell everybody that I was born in Stillwater. I was born at the vet school. When I think about it, that's kind of the truth about the deal, because Dad graduated as a DVM, and we traveled. We first started with he was in practice in Tulsa, and he did various other practices, and then he went to the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army has a veterinary corps who is responsible for food safety. So a lot of this you can say is, I've got this in my blood. And so it comes down to the fact that I was the baby under the typewriter. The girls in the front office took care of me while we were back in visiting They took care of me as a little boy when my family moved back to Amarillo. My dad went to work for Blue Morrows, and my grandfather had a heart attack and never really escaped it. As a matter of fact, he was going to build a veterinary hospital, and they were getting ready to break ground, and that never happened. He ended up running a meat factory his entire life. So, I kind of grew up in the business. I say that my Papa Blue, he was one of these guys that, I really wanted to learn to play golf. And so that's fine. Papa Blue said, fine, but you got to come work for me. So I worked in the mornings, and then we'd go and we'd play golf in the afternoons. It was quite the learning experience. And I was 13 years old. Once again, the workers' coverage where you can't employ minors, that involves anything except for the people that are within your family. And of course I was doing things like loading trucks and things that wasn't really dangerous, but those things gave me an appreciation. And then as I grew up, I worked things in the business, like learned how to do weight control. Do things like, weigh cases of hot dogs that came in that were going to go into the corn dog machine, go and weigh those and make sure that it really was truly filled correctly. Because occasionally they weren't, or occasionally they things happened. The other thing that I remember was there was a foreign object disaster that I was involved in as a kid that I remember. And we had bought some boxed beef from IBP. And in running it through the grinder, Benny, who was the guy that taught me how to run grinders, Benny hit a mesh glove that was in there. And so, I'll say my dad called up IBP and said, hey, he has this mesh glove that was in the box. And, we're not responsible for that. That wasn't us. That was you. There wasn't a mesh glove in the whole plant, right?
The cutter's glove?
A cutter's glove. And it went through a Comatrol. And I don't know whether you know a Comatrol or not, but it's like a grinder, except it has high-speed cutting knives inside of it, kind of like a food processor. And it just shattered that whole set, the blade, the knives, the holder, the entire thing. It just shattered it. And so my dad said, well, okay, you're not going to stand by your product. That's fine. And so I recall, because I was there when Benny opened the box and found a knife, a scabbard, the chain that holds it around your waist, the mesh apron, and various other things that this guy, evidently when they quit, they just threw it in a box and they hauled ass, right? So I remember being in the room when he called IVP to say, well, you know what, you said that could never happen. And they were going, well, yeah, well, it wasn't us. I said, well, are y'all missing knife number 423? Are y'all missing the scabbard and the mesh apron and stuff? And they paid the claim. And I went back and I said, lots of weird stuff can happen in these plants. And I saw some stuff happen in plants too, and I'll say from a safety standpoint, I saw things happen that, I'll say that the typical 15 or 16-year-old kid never sees, but I saw them. And we got down to, and I was like a junior in high school, and I went to work for Albertsons, in the front of Albertsons. And I always remember this because when it came to, they have a nasty job that needs to be done. They gave it to Don. So, hey, the vent hood, the county health inspector came in, the vent hood in the bakery was all packed full of junk, and somebody had to get up in there and clean it. So guess who got to go up in there and scrape this thing out and wash it down? That was me. Or clean out at that time you were allowed to burn cardboard inside an incinerator at the back of the store. You get to clean out the incinerator, right? So I did those things, and I can just consider them a normal part of the thing. And I really enjoyed learning about how cleaning processes worked. So that was kind of one of those things. It was kind of the back of my mind. I go down to Texas Tech. I go down to West Texas State. I get my degree, business degree, but that was okay. But one of the things that I did get was the last semester I got exposed to quality control, quality assurance. And I took this course and I really liked it. And I've been taking statistical courses all the way through. It's one of those things where that first course just ate my lunch, and I took it till I finally got a B in it. But the thing was, I found that there was a great link statistically and the mathematics that I was learning in those higher level courses and this quality control course that I took. got to the end, got my diploma. What do? I'm going to go work for my dad. No, I'm not going to go work for my dad because he and I really didn't see didn't have the same things that we were actually looking at from a marketing standpoint, from a sales standpoint. And then, as far as, I needed to learn some things about the real world. So I went to work for Swift Independent Packing Company. And it was a little bit of a shock for me, but it wasn't a big shock because hey, I'd been in beef plants before. I'd seen animals, I'd seen animals slaughtered. I'd seen all these things, so it didn't really bother me. And I was a hunter, so yeah, I'd gotten blood on me. It didn't really matter. They hired me. They more or less hired me on the spot when I came in, and I had this knowledge of the USDA regulations that was brought to me by a USDA inspector that said, Don, if you're going to be in this business, you need to learn it. So that summer, I sat down and read the entire USDA regulations, the manual of inspection, and the Code of Federal Regulations concerning USDA. So I knew about as much about it as anybody when I walked into that beef plant. I took some more courses. I went to University of Arkansas for a while and, worked on my master's degree. And the food engineering courses were just absolutely a blast. But what I found out was that when it came to my real world food safety experience, had a lot more information than they could actually teach me in my master's program. So more or less, I said, I'm not going to finish my master's program because guess what? Why? It's not going to really help me at that point in time. I wish that I had done that now, but I can't go back and do that now.
Similar paths. I can relate with all this. I did some time with Kroger, and as you know, when I was with in New Jersey, I read a lot of the CFRs and was learning piece by piece. But wow, so your foundation really is meat and poultry, anything from live handling to ready to eat. And as this conversation widens beyond food and into pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, agriculture, what carries over and what doesn't? Because you have so much of a diverse background, and I've spent so much time with you. You really do have a scientific mind as well as statistical process control. We talk about the dose, being the poison often.
As you look at the various parts and pieces, I'm always seem to be fascinated in how processes work and how I can draw a thread through those processes. So, for instance, you can draw a direct line between the amount of pathogens that you're trying to kill in any product and the thermal death curves, and then also the chilling curves that are associated with that. And I'll say the thermodynamics of that whole deal, it really does make sense to me for some odd reason. So I can see how the step up works. I can see the step up downs. I can see the time. I can see the changes in the degrees and how that all works. So as I look at that, I go, yeah, that's some very important things. And that works whether you're cooking briskets out on the smoker, or you're cooking industrially in somewhere in some facility or plant. The other thing that I kind of go back to is sanitation. I had a good mentor, Dr. John Butts, and Dr. John and I worked together in the real early 80s on listeria control. And you'll hear John in his talks where he starts talking a lot about seek and destroy. Well, that was me. I was the one that came up with the words seek and destroy. And I think it came from watching too many war movies as a kid or something like that. But that's kind of where all that came from. But the thing of it was, the maintenance guys absolutely hated my guts because I'd make them take things apart that they'd never taken apart before. I'd make them find the stinky things that they didn't want to really talk about. They didn't really want to talk about the black gunk that came out of the bottom of this slicer. They didn't want to talk about that, but I did. And I wanted to take it apart and look at it, find out where that actually came from. And so that kind of inspired some of the things about my engineering mind to say, well, why are we seeing this? And a lot of it was, at that particular time, there was no real standards for equipment that goes into a food plant. Just it needed to do the job that it was supposed to do. That one thing comes to mind was I had a slicer, and the slicer was produced by Great Lakes Slicer. And it was this long horizontal slicer. You laid the logs up in there, and a circular blade that was in there that cut slices. And it did a pretty good job, but it was full of harborage zones, places where they had bolted plastic and stainless steel together. And when you do that, it's impossible. You cannot get in there and get it clean. And so literally you'd end up taking this thing apart down to the frame. And I finally got the maintenance guys to understand and take the tower off this thing and to take it apart for me. And when they pulled that thing apart, I swear to you right now, the maintenance guy that was doing it threw up. And I found where it was really nasty. And where it was really nasty it was where there was a plastic part, a piece of Delrin that was bolted to two pieces of stainless steel, making a harborage sandwich. So I said, well, we can't buy the whole thing whole, but I can buy the whole thing in stainless steel. So we ordered it from Great Lakes Slicer. Oh, we've never done that in stainless steel. Well, yeah, fine. That's what I want. So they sent me this thing. And, I'll say I spent some time in the maintenance shops. I spent some time watching them make parts and pieces. And I'll be quite honest with you, I can weld a machine better than that. And I was furious when I had this part. I mean, it literally looked like a 2-year-old had hacked it out of the steel. And so I put it right back in the same box and addressed it to the president of Great Lakes Slicer Company. And I put a nasty letter in there saying, what kind of finish is this? I need answers. And I sent it back to him. Next day, I get a phone call from his secretary. And his secretary said, he got your message. And I think he understands what you're talking about. He goes, do you want to come and look at our new slicer? And I said, well, darn right I do. So here I get a plane ticket from him. I got clearance from my boss, John Butts, to go look. He was laughing about this, I know. And so I go up to Chicago to Great Lakes Slicer. They pick me up. They take me and they show me this beautiful new slicer that they have out in this beautiful warehouse. Well, first thing is, they had the first computer-aided design milling machine that I had ever seen. Beautiful piece of machinery, but absolutely producing the most horrible work out of it I think I've ever seen. And I said, well, guys, what'd you do with the guy that was machining parts in the first place? Did he retire or something? Because you should go hire him back to help set this machine back up. They said, well, what do you think of our slicer? And I said, well, I don't think much of it. Give me a mechanic so we can take the thing apart. And by the end of the day, I had a bunch of nuts and bolts and parts and pieces spread out all over the floor. And the guy was standing there, luckily, the guy from engineering was standing there making notes. You can't have hollow tubes. You can't have plastic bolted to metal in any fashion. You got to have a way where they can use cleaners on this. And I said, do you have any idea what they're cleaning this with? Well, they're cleaning this with a cleaner like. No, they're spraying caustic soda foam on this thing and washing it off to create saponification to make soap and get the soap off. They were just amazed. They had never had anybody come and talk to them that way. But what you've got to have is you've got to have somebody that's willing to tell them what the real thing is. And once you tell people what the real thing is, it's really easy for them to make a decision. Are you or are you not going to accept the reality of that situation?
That's fascinating. And going back to what you said about Dr. Butts being one of your mentors, I remember meeting Dr. Butts, and you would actually credit Dr. Butts for Seek and Destroy, and then he would credit you, and then you guys would just pass it back and forth like a ping pong ball. But what's fascinating about that, a lot of people don't know that the Listeria final rule actually stimulated from industry, because industry was actively communicating with the USDA to say, you all should be aware of this. We come bearing gifts.
So the Sentinel Site program, and this is the part it's FSIS directive, I think 5421. I can't remember the directive number. But anyway, the directive number is in direct correlation to what was presented by the Tyson Sentinel Site team. And that was Dr. Ellis Brunton at Tyson. He was there, and he and I sat down along with Scott Stillwell and Tom Osborne. They're all still friends of mine. Ellis is no longer alive now. And what we did was we just went through and we said, well, what makes the difference? We got our statistician, Dr. Zelinka, in there, and Dan we went through this, and we kind of figured out exactly, well, what is it that you're going to have to look at? And we came up with the 5, 3, and 1 rule. And you look at 5, 3, and 1. When you do a sampling and you're doing a random sampling in an environment, you should have 5 non-contact, 3 contact, and 1 that's outside of those zones to find out how it gets tracked into those zones. And we found that it was supported. I actually had to write a letter for a client. They were talking about, where did this come from? From the directive. Well, it came from, and I had to talk about the team and how the team got there. And what we found was that the number one thing that the agency was concerned about was making sure that industry found and took care of the problem. And that's number one thing. The agency wanted us to find the problem and take care of it. But what they really wanted to do was to punish people for finding it. And what the Sentinel Site program did is it, in a way, follows both those paths. The first path that it follows is that the first bite of the apple, you're doing your normal program, your first bite of the apple is kind of a freebie. So if you have a listeria species finding, then you have to go and prove that you don't have an environmental catastrophe out there. So that's the first thing. And the second thing was that it always triggered a second test in that same area and expanded around to make sure that we found where the problem was. So you're doing that big site sampling. And then the third thing is, and this is, I think, the important part from a HACCP and from a regulatory HACCP standpoint, is that when you started it back up within the regulatory framework that's supplied by 417. And by doing that, what you do is you start, number one, doing sampling of both the environment and the product. And what you do is you clear the lot until you got 3 consecutive lots worth. And once you've done that, you've done enough corrective action to be able to say, well, here's the problem that I see, is that it was here. We determined that it was either, did it live there or was it transient? If it was transient, you want to find out how it got there. That's an all-important part of this. But if it's transient, it's not affecting the product itself. But if it lives there, then you've got to have a good program of catching it. And I'll use an example. I'm not going to use the client's name. What happened was I had this client, and I got there about 6 months too late. I mean, it was everywhere. And I was trying to find out, well, where's this coming from? Where's this coming from? And we finally tracked it down to, the positives are starting to come from this little crack on this wall underneath the sink. And I started to do investigative swabs around that area and come to find out the crack was very highly contaminated. And they had just done some work underneath the building to replace some sewer that was underneath there. The thing that is there was water underneath that slab, that 50-year-old slab of that building. And the slicer that was on top of that water, where that water was causing vibration. And when I asked my friends, the structural engineers, I said, well, the typical building, how much pounds per square inch does a building exert on the ground? And it's 32 pounds per square inch. So literally, it's like stepping on a tube of toothpaste every day that they're squishing that out underneath there. So actually, to get rid of that, what we had to do is cut the floor completely out of that facility and to put new underlayment, put new seal, and new concrete in, and then look very closely. Anytime that there's a crack in that facility, they get on it right now. They immediately epoxy it, immediately try to seal it off, and immediately have that. I'll say right up until now, that's been about 4 years. They haven't had a problem, but they understand where the problem was and what they had to do to get rid of it. And so a lot of it is getting down to that.
I so appreciate you telling that story. I was involved probably 10 years ago with a company where, and this is like 2 stories in one. One, I don't think they were curious enough because they had some bad sampling on their production facility floor. and they knew they weren't getting good results. So they just stopped taking samples in certain areas.
Okay.
And then the floor went beyond its expected lifespan. A new FSQA lead comes in and says, we need to replace this. And the request gets shot down because, well, they didn't have the evidence to show that there was a problem with it. And they're like, no, there's a problem with it. So no one was wanting to continue to tell the story about how there was a problem with this. They just like, we'll just, we acknowledge it, kind of a thing. And again, it goes beyond years.
Mm-hmm.
Different leader now has the problem of saying, here's the problem, but the story that was previously told wasn't supporting that. We see this a great deal of time where either A, people are not looking for the evidence, they're not looking for the information, they're not looking for the data, or B, once they have that data, once they have that information, they don't act upon it. And that becomes not only problematic in the short term, but it becomes problematic in the long term, I believe. And especially when you look at it's not just consumers that are impacted, it's also a workforce that's going to either lose hours or lose their job entirely because a problem was allowed to go ignored for too long.
I've got a lead-in story for this. I work for a company, and probably I'm going to say the best job that I ever had. If I go back and look at my career and I say, what job would I recreate? And I would say I was director of technical services for a company called Hudson Foods. And I go back to this. I keep going back to this. What was it there that failed? And I come back to the story upon story that comes from this. Like I said, they were a great company. They were a medium-sized company. The owner, Red Hudson, was this dynamic man. He had been in the business and done many, many things before. And so he really knew what he was talking about. And he was in business to help his customer. And so he was helping a customer, and this customer was Burger King. So Mr. Hudson went all over the country looking for sites to put this new beef patty production facility. And Hudson had never done beef before. And I had just been hired to help teach HACCP and to make sure that food safety got ingrained into the system. And we were doing a pretty good job of that. And so there were two sites that were located. One of them was Columbus, Nebraska, and the other one was Petersburg, Virginia. The one in Petersburg was a joint effort, and this was to get minority ownership into their supply chain. So it was like a Burger King franchisee that had done quite well was going to sell his franchises and buy this beef plant and was going to use the monies from that to run the beef plant. We were going to supply the technical assistance to do that. So they built two plants. They were identical. One, the entrance was on the left side, the other one, the entrance on the right side. They were just mirror images of one another, right? Got them both up and running. But there was the lesson that I learned from this took several years to come out of it. I will remember I was teaching a HACCP course, and Dane Bernard is another friend of mine and another mentor. But Dane and I were teaching this HACCP course in Columbus, Nebraska. And we were teaching the management that was going to run this facility, and they were old beef guys from way back, right? And so we're talking about this and going through the hazard analysis and talking about this. And I'm going, wait a minute, guys, there's something here that bothers me. And you go, well, what's that? And I said, well, what do we do with the bone collection stuff that comes out of that? We just throw that away, right? Oh, no, we got to run that back in through. And I said, well, okay, but what do we do with it? Well, we got to run it back through the system and scavenge it, make sure we go, okay, well, that's fine. But you're putting it back into the system and causing, may have a crossover issue. Well, that's never been a problem before. I don't have to worry about that. Nobody does it that way, Don. Okay. They put the HACCP plan in place. They ran the HACCP plan for about 2 years. There comes a food safety issue that cropped up, an 0157H7 contamination that happened. And I will say that USDA was equally to blame at this because their enforcement guys were out to make a name for themselves and were holding information back. At least that's what the court case showed for Mr. Gregory when he was brought up on charges of obstructing justice. Actually, enforcement officer was obstructing justice and not giving him the information in a timely manner. But it came down to the Secretary of Agriculture saying, we're sending the SWAT team in, we're going to shut that plant down, we're going to do this. And so, I'll be honest with you, I've been testing for 015787 because Director of Tech Services, I had the responsibility of finding that. But we did not have the methodology that was available to actually determine whether we had contamination or not. We didn't know what size sample we needed. We didn't know what our lot size was. We didn't know anything. And I come back to that and I go, well, there was some really good research that was done. Dr. Muhammad Kamari, another guy that I really like and consider a mentor. But when we look at that, we go, the USDA didn't do a good job of determining that there was a problem here, and they'd had a problem, 5 or 10 years before that they hadn't reacted well to. And so I go back to that and I go, how many people do we got to kill for them not to identify something and make sure and take action on it? It goes further. They're still doing it today. USDA pulled back on salmonella criteria on, I'm going to say, par-fried poultry, say the chicken cordon bleus and that sort of thing, because it looks fully cooked, but guess what? It's not fully cooked. And, going back to what Darin was saying a minute ago, when it all came down to it, 300 people lost their livelihoods and they closed the plant because guess what? There's no way that they could comply with what the regulatory was throwing at them. And there was no way that the plant could run from a supply standpoint because nobody would supply them chicken under that criteria. So somewhere under the regulatory and the plant dynamic, we have to all come to agreement on how things are going to be done, because it's not the regulators, it's not the universities, it's not the plants, it's all and everybody involved. Everybody has to be curious and has to understand and ask the right questions. And when those right questions are asked, they don't need to be shut down.
I'm seeing a trend because I was just reading Bill Marler's post about some of the agencies withholding information. So that definitely struck something. But with this, I think you were alluding to the fact that how Hudson addressed things, and you were a part of a recovery process, not necessarily a recall. Was it? I guess I should preface it with the question: did it actually boil down to becoming a recall?
10 million pounds. I was the title holder for about 6 years.
Wow!
Until Cargill unseated me with a 15 million pound recall.
So, what did this reveal about the brand protection in this particular process?
Well, I think that the first thing was in trying to satisfy a customer's requirements, Hudson kind of got into a business that they really didn't quite understand. And from a brand protection standpoint, you got to understand that. They made Red Hudson look like a total idiot in front of CNN in a news conference. In the month before that, Burger King awarded Hudson Foods Supplier of the Year and gave them this crystal thing, this crystal Burger King or whatever it was. I don't remember what it was that, we had in the front lobby. As a matter of fact, it was in frame. And if I been Mr. Hudson, I think I'd have smashed that right there in front of him, because guess what? We were named Supplier of the Year from Burger King. And we've been trying to understand how Burger King wants this done, and they did not understand. All they wanted was to come screaming from the building and not take into account that, their process was more than lethal. Even if we'd been supplying them 5 log of E. coli 015787, their process was good enough where it wasn't going to be a problem.
Wow. Well, there's been some positive experiences from what I've gathered and research that I've done prior to actually getting to work closely with you. And that was through the design animal handling system along with Dr. Temple Grandin. So what did that teach you about building systems and how these people and the animals actually behave rather than how we wish they would?
I'd be honest with you, I love Temple Grandin. She really, really can see processes and can see things that are different. And I'm going to tell my Temple Grandin story. I was working at Creekstone Farms down in Ark City, and she was the one that designed and built that entire animal welfare facility. Everything. I mean, She came in and oversaw the creation of that facility and the knocking process and the hoisting process and the killing process, the entire thing. I mean, literally, she crawled into the restrainer and told them to go ahead and put it around my leg and let me go off the end and ride the chain up like a cow would so that she could see what it saw. And I mean, I go, you like to kill Temple Grandin? Why did you do that? So, I mean, there's some crazy stuff, but everybody gets their day with Temple. And I had my day with Temple Grandin. And, I'm going to say that intellectually, I felt like that I had to run the entire day to keep up with her because she was just brilliant. We talked about animal welfare. We talked about drug residues. We talked about lots of different things. I took her down, and she's sitting there and she's just kind of looking, and she kind of just looks and her eyes kind of blink kind of weird. And she goes, "Oh, the cattle are about 2 inches taller now." And it's like the shield that we have to keep people from seeing people that were down further beyond the thing was too low. So now that the animals could actually see you moving. So we had to extend that shield up to kind of blind off where the animals were. And, we walked through the facility and just listening to her about, how shadows were. Because what had happened was previously there had been skylights that were in this facility and they'd been knocked out by a hailstorm. And so the facility said, well, we'll just cover those over with plywood and we'll replace them when we get the chance. Well, they never did. And what happened was you ended up putting more lights in there, which caused other problems. And it was like, no, guys, we got to put the lights back in there. It's impeding inspection of antemortem inspection by the USDA. So they put the skylights back in. And now it's more like what it was. It's more like being outside than being inside. And so I took Temple through there. I'll say I really learned a lot that day. And then I took Temple back to Wichita, and I took her to a friend of mine's restaurant. We had Creekstone Burgers, and we had a really good time. And then I said, well, I have a question, Temple. Have you been into a veterinary hospital? And she goes, well, no, I haven't been to a veterinary hospital. I went, well, great. Sarah would like to meet you, my wife. She's a veterinarian. I would like for you to see this hospital. So I walked into the Cutter Pet Care over here, where Sarah was working at the time. And, of course, the veterinary technicians are now fangirling Temple Grandin, but just following her around. What's she saying? We're looking at, and Sarah's taking her around, showing her, how they're handling the animals correctly. She's pretty impressed, right? That's pretty cool. And so then we ended up going back around by where they were doing grooming and where they had the kennels. And you could hear the dogs barking back there. And we went back there, and you could tell that Temple had something to say. And so I took her back to the inn, and I brought her back out, and she goes, Don, if you'd have a little less light down that end and a little more light down this end, they wouldn't bark as much. Really? Why? He goes, well, they're seeing shadows. They're seeing the people moving beyond that window, and it's reflecting back into the room. And I went, They tried it that night, and the dogs were really quiet after that.
Wow. That's fascinating.
And I'll say that my wife Sarah is in the process of buying a veterinary clinic right now, and I told that story to the veterinarian that's selling the clinic, and she was shocked that I knew Temple Grandin. So she was shocked that I would take Temple Grandin into a veterinary hospital and actually get something from it. So what you learn from that is different points of view need to be looked at very carefully, and people see things differently. And you need to find out, do you have somebody that sees sanitation differently? Do you have somebody that sees animal handling differently? I'm going to tell you, those guys that do the right thing on animal handling are the most amazing guys that you've ever run across. And I'll say gentle in a certain way, but rough in another. But guess what? They really try to do what's best for the animal. I take my hat off to those guys every day because, day in and day out, they go in and they move animals through the facility safely, efficiently, and humanely. And I go, that's something that we never get credit for. We never get credit for, hey, there was 500,000 head that were killed today, and the greater majority of them were killed humanely. That met the standard.
That's a powerful statement, because I think that there's a lot of what is done in product safety that's not really given credit. And I know that we could go down a rabbit hole, but we have to land the plane soon. But you had said something that reminded me about what was going on in Boar's Head, and how somebody spoke up from sanitation to say, hey, we need to address this. And then it just got squashed. And then that also goes back to Peanut Corporation of America, where there was rainwater coming in and bird droppings and such. So it's important that people don't just allow their specific findings to be shut down and disregarded.
I'm going to say that there's a lack of understanding of what ethics means, and understanding that what you're doing, you're not protecting your corporation's profit margin. You're keeping several 100,000 people from dying today. And I talk about this. I talk about this in my HACCP plan. And Trevor, you've been through my HACCP plan, so you know this. I'll talk about this and say, guys, how many lives do you touch in a day? And I calculated in one plant. I calculated it was like 5 or 6 million lives we touched in a day. And that's not only the products that they ate, but it was like the other materials that came off of it that went through another process that somehow ended back up in the food stream. So there was lots of different things as you look at it, that how many lives do you touch in a day? If you understand that, and you have that understanding that that's your family, those are the people that you love. And you know what? It's no different than putting a gun to their head.
And it goes into the other conversation that we had with Kristen King about, well, how many people have to actually suffer from this or die in order for something to change? So it all comes full circle.
We have the ability. We just don't have the willpower. I had a pet food manufacturer came in when I was at the veterinary clinic. We're going to have this wonderful fresh food for doggies, right? And I went, excuse me? I hope like hell that you're going to do something like high pressure processing or something to this to kill the pathogens that's in it, or you're going to get the same results that the Blue Buffalo guys get. Oh well,
Yeah.
Hey guys, yeah, okay. It cost you a couple extra cents, but a couple extra cents, it makes your food safety and quality guys sleep a lot easier at night. It makes you not get this terrible feeling that there's something wrong, but there's nothing that you can do about it. You don't want to get shut down. And I tell you, I've been shut down so many times. We can always buy it cheaper, Don.
Yeah,
I know. But guess what? It may be cheaper, but it may as hell not be better.
well said.
Nobody does it that way, Don. Nobody does it that way. Yeah? Fine. So, but you know what? You're the number one marketer of this particular product, and how much is your brand protection worth? Is it worth a little bit of hardship that's coming on right now just to get that done?
Yeah.
You know what? I've lost those jobs, and you know what? I have no problem at all with losing those jobs like that, because eventually, guess what? Something bad happens, and they will be in the hot seat over that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more to cover, and I want to, in tradition of what we do for all of our guests, is who would you recommend that we have on this particular podcast, or even invite to the summit to be a speaker or a part of a panel?
One person that I worked with, and he and I think much alike, Dr. Dale Rice. Now, Dale is a veterinarian now. Dale is one of those guys that when he was 45 years old, decided he was going to go to veterinary school. He bailed out as a executive executive vice president of Nestle North America. And he bailed out. He bailed out to go to veterinary school and to treat dogs and horses. But the thing of it is, he's got some really cool ideas. He's got some cool stories, and he and I work together enough where, yeah, there's some cool things that I think that he could have to say. He was the quality director that was there when the guys created the Hot Pockets brand.
There's so much more for us to come back to, without a doubt. And we also still need to go fishing. I just want to put that out there. But with this, we'll go ahead and land the plane.
Thanks for listening to the Thought Leader Product Safety Innovation Podcast. If this conversation raised new questions or perspectives, we invite you to continue with us at the upcoming Thought Leader Summit this summer. You can find more details in the show notes. Until next time, keep asking the questions that matter.